Senator Carr.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I speak to this bill having thoroughly considered the matters as part of the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Legislation Committee. As Deputy Chair of the committee, the substantive report that we have provided contains a very, I think, comprehensive response to this very flawed bill. On behalf of the Labor Party, Senator Chisholm and myself have produced that document, which I might say is much more substantive than the government's report. And the reason we've had to do this is because the bill is so basically flawed. This is a bill that may well set out to have an intent to deal with questions that the Minister has just outlined. It was, in fact, a response to an election announcement, as the public servants made very, very clear. It was, in fact, in response to a very, very thin legislative program by this government in the context where they had very little to say during an election campaign, and as the various departments and agencies presented to the committee demonstrated with their meagre submissions of one page only. The departments have clearly not consulted widely, have not provided an exposure draft of the legislation, have demonstrated just how grossly underprepared they were to deal with this legislation. We can see here where a government has put forward a proposal in search of essentially a response to a problem that has yet to be demonstrated can be dealt with in the way in which the government claims. There is a real risk in this bill that the government will actually fail to achieve its stated aims. The bill has been hyped as a necessary response to farm invasion by animal rights activists, but of course is put in a context where there are at the moment 31 separate pieces of legislation, statutes across this country to deal with matters which the Attorney General's Department has identified, which we publish in this report here, goes for page after page of detail on what the actual legislative response is across the Commonwealth in terms of identifying those issues, and where the states are currently strengthening their legislative response to the claims that are being made by the groups that have recently published the addresses of farms and abattoirs in this country. Now, of course, we know that trespass is normally and properly prosecuted by state and territory jurisdictions. So are theft and property damage, and so is incitement. And like trespass, this is a crime that's been covered in common law throughout the history of this nation. All the legal armoury needed to crack down on farm invaders already exists. But you see, this is not a bill that deals with the question of trespass. This is not a bill about trespass. This is a bill about incitement. It's about incitement. And it goes far beyond farms. It goes not far beyond agricultural premises. It goes to the food production premises in cities. It goes to aquacultural facilities. It goes to some research facilities. It goes to some facilities on private land, but not on public land. It's inconsistent in its approach. It deals with fish processing plants. It deals with vegetable processing plants that deal with fish processing. It deals with a series of measures which clearly have not been thought through because it's been drafted in such a hasty manner. This is legislation which has been brought forward with little consequence, or little thought to the consequence of the broader implications of this legislation. Now, the bill creates two new offences under the Criminal Code: the use of a carriage service, such as the internet, to incite others on trespass or damage and destroy or steal or property on agricultural land and agricultural-related activity. And of course it was promoted because of the publication of certain facilities by animal rights activists. Now, the Labor Party has been made very, very clear, strongly opposes farm invasions, and I personally have strongly opposed people that move on to kill forts and abattoirs or seek to close down abattoirs or seek to undermine the work of our meat industry in this country. I've long been associated with the meat industry in this country. So to suggest that somehow or another we're implicated with, what do you call it, vegan terrorism, is a complete nonsense. A complete nonsense. You see, the whole question here, we've made it very, very clear. We are very, very clear about the nature...
Order.
If I may, please, Madam Acting Deputy President, and the rest of us have sat quietly through other senators' contribution, but I can't hear Senator Carr by the shrill screaming by Senator McKim down there. I'd ask you to bring me to order.
Senator McKim.
Yes, thank you. On the point of order, Madam Acting Deputy President, I was just seeking to defend Senator Watt, who's not here to defend himself, because Senator Carr was attacking him mercilessly for his speech.
Senator McKim, I do remind senators that disorderly behaviour will not be tolerated, and I actually could not hear Senator Carr either.
So the Labor Party has strongly supported the very best international best practice in animal welfare, the establishment of an independent office of animal welfare, and we see there is absolutely no contradiction in prevention of animal cruelty and supporting the proper and best practice in regard to livestock, farming and flourishing of the meat processing industry. And of course, you would expect that's what this bill should be seeking to do. But there's considerable evidence to suggest that's not what this bill actually does, and that's why it needs substantive amendment. There are so many unintended consequences. I'll try to list some of them. And the Law Council pointed out to the Senate inquiry the bill's quite clearly unnecessary given the range of state matters that are being dealt with. It's disproportionate in the fact that the penalties imposed under these measures are actually much higher than the actions taken by people that actually do the trespassing. There is a bizarre aspect that in some cases you get 6 months for trespassing in the States, but 5 years for using the telephone. The penalties imposed here, as I say, are disproportionate. They're perverse outcomes. And of course we have to actually ask the question whether or not there has been proper consideration of what the consequences of that might be. And there is of course the very serious issue in terms of the threat that actually occurs in terms of rural protest movements in regard to legitimate industrial activity by Australian workers. And that's the real thing that worries me about this bill. The consequence it has for meat workers, whether it be the red meat, whether it be the white meat, whether it be in the pork industry, whether it be in the chicken industry, whether it be for the NUW, the National Union of Workers, whether it be for the AWU in the dairy industry, whether it be the AMIEU across this country. The consequences it has for whistleblowers. The minister points out that there are issues in regard to public interest declarations. We've got people on trial in this country at the moment for whistleblowing. We've got journalists who are raided in this country at the moment for exercising their position as journalists. And you're going to try and tell me there's adequate protections in this legislation. There is a real serious risk here that when you undermine the capacity to provide that whistleblowing service that people do provide, the work that journalists do, that you actually enhance organised crime in this country. And you say to me, oh, well, what's an extreme statement, isn't it? In the meat industry, what did we have? The Woodward Royal Commission. Minister, you're so clever, you know so much about this. Do you remember the Jodhpur report? Now, the AMIEU were raided because of their involvement in whistleblowing, where they exposed drug running, firearms running, money counterfeiting, meat substitution, And all of those matters were picked up in the Chopper report. And those companies that were named, this is organised crime by meat industry companies. Many of those companies named in that report are still operating. Now, if you actually impair the capacity of whistleblowers and journalists, of industrial organisations, you actually may well advance the case for criminals to act. Then you've got the case of illegal abattoirs operating. 3 weeks ago, the ABC broadcast footage from the nightly news in Melbourne of an illegal, unregistered abattoir where beasts were slaughtered and placed in the backs of cars and distributed to families in Melbourne. A very serious public health risk. Now, these are issues that go to the actual public safety of our community. Not about animal liberation, not about animal activists on farms, about the capacity to actually defend our community where the regulators in this country are overwhelmed. So they're not able to do their job properly and require the assistance of journalists and whistleblowers to protect the public. Now, the AMIAU has been heavily involved in providing that community service. Not a bunch of, what do you call them? Terrorists. Good, hard-working, blue-collar Australians protecting Australians. And you, of course, put forward legislation that may seriously impede their capacity. Then, of course, there's their industrial rights. See, one day you can be on a plant, next day you're laid off, trespassing, what? An organiser incites. And in this country, we've had example after example where officials have been prosecuted for incitement. Now, we have a long history of farmers who have taken an interest in public protest. The pipeline protest group in my state, 10 years ago, sought to march on the Premier of Victoria's farm, occupy his farm. In 2011, potato growers drove 50 tractors to blockade the McCain's factory in Wendouree, to protest the way in which they were treated on potato pricing. In 2012, protesters against Sole Seam Gas engaged in 10 days in the Kerry Valley in Queensland against Arrow Energy. 2013, farmers in Warrnambool staged protests against low milk prices. We, of course, have seen action taken against Santos on coal seam gas. We've seen farmers just recently on water rights. Aren't they equally entitled to present their case? Are they not threatened by measures such as that contained in bills such as this? We've got a rich tradition in this country of public protest. And so we've got to be wary of unintended consequences, and that's what this Senate report draws to our attention. It is the job of the Senate committees to look at the detail, not be carried away by the hype, the fake news, the very, very poor reporting on these matters, to look at the actual detail of legislation. Now, of course, you'll be told that this will never, ever happen. We will never see this sort of legislation used improperly. Well, Mr Mark Malley, the Editorial Policy Manager of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation made the point to the committee, whatever your intentions of the bill, paraphrasing, said, the intention of the bill and the honest intention of framers of the bill at the moment, I'm perfectly prepared to believe the intention of the bill is exactly what they've described. But it doesn't necessarily control how it will be interpreted or used potentially in a very different political environment, a very different environment of public opinion. These things do have an impact on how these sorts of pieces of legislation can be used. But whatever the legislations are, we have to think, how could this legislation potentially be misused? We have, of course, the position that was put to us by the journalists from the Right to Know, that similarly from the Murdoch newspapers, the case that has to be put is to be seen in the context of how could this legislation be reasonably interpreted in other circumstances, because it's been very badly thought through. As I said, I am very concerned about what it means for workers, and we have seen throughout the history of this country how workers have been subject to various pieces of legislation brought forward in one context, used entirely differently in another. I'm very concerned about the consequences for whistleblowers and for journalists. I'm very concerned about what we know to be the long history of crime in the meat industry and the incapacity of the regulatory authorities to deal with that. But I'm particularly concerned about the consequences for research facilities. We saw, when I was minister, the situation where there is the CSIRO facilities here in Canberra were in fact destroyed. We know the situation there, where state territory legislation was actually used in the circumstances. But the point is, why aren't they covered by this bill if this is such a big issue? Why isn't the use of agricultural land definition to go to that issue? Then, of course, there are other scientific research undertaken in other facilities which is directly related to agriculture, which doesn't come within a bull's roar of being dealt with. This is a bill which has been rushed into this parliament. The government's created expectations for some of its stakeholders that it'll be able to deliver on. When you ask the federal police what is the extra resource that's going to be put in to enforcing this legislation, the answer is none. No additional resource. What we have here is a bill, whatever the political objectives of this government, and I might be somewhat suspicious about their intent, what we can say is that the states and territories have clear responsibilities, and they have responsibilities for a more rigorous enforcement of their laws. They have an obligation to protect farmers, but they also have an obligation to protect workers and their families. But to act in haste and to draft legislation which has so badly been thought through may well have quite serious unintended consequences which will be with us for some considerable time. I always find it ironic when we hear from the Conservative benches how we need to expand Commonwealth powers, given they spend so much time talking to us about the need for deregulation. But this is yet another example where we're getting a bid to grow the Commonwealth, to expand the Commonwealth. This bill doesn't do the job that the bill's supporters claim it will. It needs extensive amendment. We'll soon see just how strong the government's bona fides are in that regard. If the government's genuinely concerned about animal welfare, it would at least follow the advice of the RSPCA, which says we are miles behind international best practice. We've made no effort to come anywhere near international best practice. If the government's genuinely concerned about protecting farmers, it would at least provide the resources to the federal police to back this up.
Yes. We have listened for 19 minutes. It wasn't clear from Senator Carr's contribution, whether the Labor Party would actually be supporting the bill. My impression was they were, but we've heard 19 minutes of him arguing against. So perhaps in the last minute he might be able to clarify for us what his and the Labor Party's position is.
Thank you, Senator Seselja. Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Senator Carr, you will be able to continue your contribution, noting that you've got 50 seconds to let us know your position.
Explain to the ignorant minister at the table that I clearly should borrow my hearing aids because he has enormous difficulty understanding even the most elementary propositions. He should also take the trouble to actually read the Senate report, which highlights the gross flaws in the government's approach. And what happens when you try to run these sorts of smears against people is you're likely to get a very strong response from the people you're seeking to smear. This is another example where the government has nothing serious to say about the future directions of the country and tries to come up with these political gimmicks instead of trying to deal with the substantive problems that farmers are facing, that workers are facing in this country, and that with an industry that is of such importance to the economic performance of this country, you would have thought the government could have done a much, much better job than this.
Senator Roberts.